Hello! Today I'm going to be taking a brief, albeit hopefully considered look at the 1997 release Rival Schools United by Fate. Now this discrete inclusion to the PlayStation 1's fighting game catalogue is a solid example of Capcom's ability to put out a decent fighting game. Much in the same vein as Marvel vs. Capcom, the game featured a tag element, which I believe, actually yes indeed it did, predate Tekken Tag Tournament as well. And the game is partitioned up into these team presets, if you like, these kind of teams which are defined by their schools. And it's a very unique sort of title that really firstly used the early tag element to very good effect. It also used polygons to very good effect, which Capcom weren't really renowned for at that time. You know, looking back at the early Street Fighters, Street Fighter Alpha were very much in this kind of 2D plane. And it made very good use of 3D space to deliver this fluid feel and this fluid movement and an integrated feel between player and setting, you know, during the gameplay. So turning to the setting, it's straight out of a Japanese high school sort of stereotype, the likes of which we see in many mangas and animes coming out of the country. The high school setting serves the game well, and you know the rivalries between the five key schools featured in the game give a legitimate narrative device for the fighting that takes place between these teams. And it's also a nice way, I think, to partition up the different characters, their different attitudes, their different aesthetics, and their different fighting styles. You know, just as an obvious example, the characters of Shoma, Natsu, and Roberto, who all attend Gorin High School together, they all specialise in sport, and you know, Shoma, for example, has a baseball bat, Natsu's a netball player, and Roberto's a football player, or a soccer player, depending on where you're from. So, you know, this seems legitimate, and it segues very legitimately into the setting of Rival Schools, because Gorin High School is a school that specialises in sports and Olympic prospects. And as such, their movesets and their characteristics all hinge around the idea of sports. So this dynamic of the game can't be understated, as it's very easy in fighting games, I think, to get quite bland characters, you know, and in many games characters are only really distinguished by their movesets. I'm kind of clutching at straws for an example, but I think Virtual Fighter was an example of where everyone's sort of out of this Japanese karate setting and nobody had much uniqueness. You know, Street Fighter was actually always very good at having this kind of motley crew of characters, as was Tekken, but Rival Schools really kind of partitions up these parties really well, and we have clearly defined teams with interesting movesets and independent, unique movesets and appearances that maintain an interest and an engagement with them, you know, even outside of the story arcs, even if there was no story to kind of weave Rival Schools together. I think the variety of characters you have to hand to tag team up was enough to make this game a really decent game. That said, though, you know, the story arc, such that it is quite thin on the ground, but it doesn't overdo it and it doesn't overcomplicate things, and it's enough to kind of propel the game forwards. There's a strong sense of camaraderie between the teams of three that you have, which is really good. And although I used to be kind of ill-conceived of Japan's penchant for violence, there actually is this kind of epidemic in Japan apparently, or there used to be anyway. I think it's dying down, but you had like girl gangs, you had students beating up teachers, which was really like a serious problem in various prefectures of Japan. And I also saw a movie called Blue Spring, and if you're into kind of Japanese culture and Japanese anime and just the school setting of Japan, Blue Spring is a really cool movie that echoes Rival Schools quite well. And it's about how this high school in some undernourished prefecture of Japan is really kind of rough, and there's people who graduate and their kind of prospects after graduating are joining the Yakuza, and that's pretty much it. But anyway, it's kind of outside of the remit of this talk, but it's a cool movie, so if you like Rival Schools, check out Blue Spring. So turning to the brief storyline of Rival Schools, which, as I said, is quite thin on the ground, but it's enough to propel the story forward, and you know, it's not too convoluted or ridiculous. But basically, we have who we initially think is the primary antagonist, who's a guy called Reizo, who's hypnotizing students, and we're not sure why, but kind of the students are appearing with red eyes and they're being really antagonistic and we're not sure why. And it turns out actually behind Reizo, who's also being hypnotized himself, is his nephew Hayo, who is basically hypnotizing the hard students of Japan to try and corrupt the youth and help him take over Japan. I think that's basically the bare bones of the story. So yeah, it's revealed that Hayo is some form of hypnotist, or he has some brainwashing ability, and the fights that you undertake throughout the arcade mode are against students who have fallen prey, or mostly against students who have fallen prey to this brainwashing. A really strange fact actually about the antagonist is confirmed that Batsu, who is the kind of poster boy protagonist of rival schools, you know, the dude in the blue suit and the red gloves, he's actually the son of Reizo, which weirdly makes him cousins with the primary bad guy, who's Hayo. I'm not sure if that's ever brought up in the game dialogue or not, but you know, that is the official kind of Capcom backstory, so I'm not sure if they explore those relationships any further. And again, you know, it's a kind of fighting game, so it doesn't really warrant it. I found that an interesting fact. So anyway, with this basic premise in place, the player then works through a series of arcade fights as a tag team pair, which you get to kind of choose yourself. And for optimal narrative purposes, I think it's best to do it as characters from the same school. I'm not sure, I can't remember if you can mix up the schools or not. But it's a slightly strange arrangement regardless, because there's 3 characters to each school gang, and you can only choose 2 to play as, which I think is actually a good thing, because, you know, if there's some characters that you don't really like, you don't have to play as them, you don't have to have a tag team formed of them. You know, again, going back to Gorin High School, if you only like Shoma and Natsu, then you don't have to have Roberto in your team if you don't want. So, and another thing, actually, speaking about the characters, there's a neat cameo from, well, I don't know if it's a cameo, she's a playable character, but Sakura from Street Fighter is here. And I just thought that was really neat. And even more recently, actually, characters from rival schools have cameos in the background of the stages in Street Fighter V. I think you can see Tiffany, and there's a couple of others there. So I'm hoping that there's going to be further recognition by Capcom about rival schools, and, you know, whether the rival schools universe does kind of sit in the remit of Street Fighter. So we might see some more crossovers. And finally, actually getting on to this point, I think a really big downer about rival schools is that it's, as of now, it's unavailable in the West on the PlayStation Store or pretty much anywhere else. I read into this issue, and I think the party line from Capcom was that they have issues with the licensing for the music, so they're not allowed to put it out again. I'm not sure how true that is. But it really sucks, because this game is awesome, and I'd really like to see either a remake or a sequel. I know there's a second Rival Schools, but, you know, I'd like to see kind of one brought up to today's standards. Would be absolutely awesome. Because, yeah, at the moment it's a real ball ache for anyone outside of Japan to try and get hold of it. I used to have the original game, but I don't know where it's gone, and I don't want to get into that. But anyway, finally, it's just worthwhile to note that Hideaki Itsuno, who is the game's director, has actually stated numerous times he'd like to put out a remake of the game, which would be really cool to see, and bringing the likes of Batsu, Shoma and Daigo into the 21st century would be absolutely fantastic, and I think they could really do a lot with this series, as it still has quite a large cult following, you know, despite the fact it came out 2 decades ago.